Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. A betrayal at sea. The storm that changed everything. The wind screamed across the open sea, whipping the waves into monstrous walls of water. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the sky in jagged, violent bursts. Rain pelted down in sheets, drenching the deck of the small boat that rocked dangerously against the unrelenting ocean. Emma Evans clung to the side of the boat, her knuckles white, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. Her long, dark hair was soaked, strands clinging to her face as she struggled to stay upright. Her father stood before her. His face was void of emotion, his cold gray eyes unreadable. "Please," Emma begged, her voice raw. "Daddy, don't do this." But Richard Evans didn't flinch. There was no hesitation in the way his fingers tightened around her wrist, no hesitation in the way he dragged her toward the edge. "This is the only way," he muttered, almost to himself. Emma's stomach twisted with terror. She had once trusted this man with her life. She had believed in the bedtime stories, in the gentle hand on her shoulder when she cried. But that man was gone. Now he was just a stranger with her father's face. "You know too much," Richard said finally, his voice flat. Emma's body went cold. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The offshore accounts. The missing people. The whispered threats she had overheard on late-night phone calls. She wasn't supposed to know. She had confronted him, foolishly believing there was still some good left in him, that the man who had raised her would choose her over his secrets. But she had been wrong. The boat lurched violently as another wave crashed against it, sending Emma sprawling onto the slick deck. She gasped, trying to scramble away. But Richard was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, yanked her up, and with one final push, he threw her into the sea. The last thing Emma saw was his silhouette disappearing into the storm. Then the ocean swallowed her whole. Sinking into darkness, the icy water crashed around her, knocking the breath from her lungs. The weight of the storm pushed her down, deeper and deeper, until the light from the surface faded into darkness. She kicked wildly, her lungs burning, but the waves tossed her like a rag doll. Salt water filled her mouth, her nose, choking her. She was going to die. Tears mixed with the salt, but there was no one to see them, no one to help her. Her father had made sure of that. Her limbs grew weak, exhaustion dragging at her, but just as the darkness threatened to claim her completely, a light. Faint at first, then closer, and thin. Strong arms wrapped around her. Emma's world tilted as she was pulled upward, away from the cold, away from the black abyss that had almost become her grave. The last thing she felt before slipping into unconsciousness was the sensation of warmth. A stranger's mercy. Ethan Bennett had seen many things in his lifetime. Storms that tore through the ocean like vengeful gods, ships lost to the depths, lives that vanished beneath the waves. But nothing had prepared him for this. Over there, one of his crewmen had shouted, pointing toward the dark waters. Ethan had barely had time to react before he saw it, a figure floating lifelessly among the raging waves. Without thinking, he had leaped into the water, ignoring the bitter cold that clawed at his skin. And now, as he pulled the fragile, unconscious girl onto his yacht, a strange feeling settled in his chest. She was so small, so still, like a broken bird, her skin pale, her lips blue. "Get blankets," he barked, his voice sharper than intended. A crew member rushed forward, wrapping her in a thermal sheet. Ethan crouched beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse. Weak, but there. Relief washed over him. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice softer now. "Stay with me." For a moment, nothing happened. Then her eyes fluttered open, Ethan sucked in a breath. The fear in those eyes, a fear deeper than the storm they had just braved, hit him like a blow. Then she whispered something. 3 words. Words that would change everything. "Help me, please." And then she collapsed. Ethan stared at her, his hands tightening into fists. Whoever had done this, whoever had left this girl to die, was going to pay. The fight to keep her alive. The rain had lessened by the time they reached the private dock, but the tension in Ethan's chest hadn't eased. "Call the doctor to meet us," he ordered as the crew carried the girl inside. Minutes later, they were rushing into a hospital, the sterile white walls a sharp contrast to the chaos of the storm. A nurse whisked the girl away, and Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was she? Where had she come from? And more importantly, who had left her to die? Hours passed before a doctor finally approached, pulling off his gloves. "She's stable," he said, exhaustion in his tone. "Mild hypothermia. Dehydration. But no serious injuries." Ethan nodded, relief flooding his veins. "Can I see her?" "She's asleep," the doctor said hesitantly. "But yes, just be gentle." Ethan didn't hesitate. He entered the room quietly, his heart hammering as he saw her lying there. She looked even smaller now, swallowed by layers of hospital blankets. Ethan took a slow breath and sat beside her bed. For a long time, he just watched. Then, suddenly, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, her gaze flickering with confusion, fear, and something else, something that made Ethan's chest tighten. She flinched, shrinking back into the pillows. "It's okay," Ethan said gently. "You're safe now." Her lips trembled. Tears welled in her eyes. And then her voice, hoarse but steady, broke the silence. "He tried to kill me." Ethan's stomach dropped. His jaw clenched, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "Who?" he asked. She hesitated. Her fingers clutched the blanket like a lifeline. Then, finally, she whispered the words that would set everything in motion. "My father." Ethan felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. His hands curled into fists, his mind racing. A father who tried to drown his own daughter. A girl who knew something she wasn't supposed to know. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady but full of emotion. Why would he do that? Emma's breath shuddered. "Because I saw something," she murmured. "Something I wasn't supposed to see." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He didn't know what this girl had uncovered. He didn't know who her father was. But one thing was clear. She wasn't safe, and Ethan would do everything in his power to protect her. The secret she shouldn't have known. A millionaire's protection. Ethan Bennett had built his empire from nothing. He had fought tooth and nail for every ounce of success, clawed his way out of poverty, out of loss, out of despair. He had survived the business world, navigated ruthless competitors, and turned a single investment into a global empire. But none of that had prepared him for the sight of a broken, terrified girl, lying in a hospital bed, whispering the words that had knocked the breath from his lungs. "My father tried to kill me." Ethan's entire body went rigid. His first instinct was rage, the kind of rage that settled deep in the bones, the kind that turned cold and deadly. But his second instinct was to protect. Whatever had happened to this girl, whoever had tried to end her life, had failed. And as long as Ethan had breath in his lungs, they would never get another chance. The weight of truth. Emma's fingers trembled against the hospital blanket. She had spent the last several hours trapped in a nightmare, one she still wasn't sure she had truly escaped. Her father had thrown her into the sea, left her to drown, abandoned her like she was nothing. And now here she was, alive, saved by a man she had never met, a man who wasn't supposed to be part of the story. Ethan leaned forward, his dark green eyes steady but intense. "Emma," he said slowly, "I need you to tell me everything." She hesitated. She had already said too much. If she told him everything, would she be putting him in danger too? Her father was powerful, connected. If he found out she was still alive, he wouldn't stop. She knew that with absolute certainty. I can't, she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. Emma, he said, voice softer now. Whoever did this to you, they won't stop. You know that, don't you? Emma looked away. Yes, she knew. That's what terrified her the most. The secret she shouldn't have known. Ethan watched her, every instinct telling him she was hiding something huge. It wasn't just about a father who wanted her gone. It was about what she had seen. Emma, he pressed, lowering his voice. What did you see? Her breath hitched. For a moment, she almost told him. Almost. But then, the door burst open. A nurse walked in, clipboard in hand. I need to check her vitals. The spell was broken. Emma shrunk back, nodding quickly, grateful for the interruption. Ethan clenched his jaw. She wasn't ready. But he wasn't giving up. An unwanted guest. The next morning, Ethan sat in the hospital waiting room, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. He had barely slept. His mind kept replaying the events of the night. The storm, the rescue, the way Emma had whispered those 3 words. He had called in every favor he had. By now, he had his own team digging into her father. Richard Evans, a high-profile investor with a spotless public record, a man known for his charm, his philanthropy, his generous donations to charities. And yet this was the same man who had thrown his own daughter into the ocean. Ethan's fists clenched. That mask of wealth and power. It was just that. A mask. Whatever Emma had discovered, it was dangerous. And Ethan was going to find out exactly what it was. But before he could act, the doors to the hospital lobby swung open. A man walked in. Tall, expensive suit, cold eyes. Ethan's stomach dropped. Richard Evans. He had found her. A father's lies. Richard didn't spot Ethan at first. He walked straight to the nurse's station, his expression carefully crafted into one of concern and exhaustion. I'm looking for my daughter, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. She was brought in last night. The nurse glanced at the records. Emma Evans. Yes, Richard said. I'm her father. Ethan stood slowly, his entire body brimming with restrained fury. Richard still hadn't noticed him. I was so worried, Richard continued, shaking his head. She's been going through a difficult time. She ran away from home. Ethan saw red. Before the nurse could respond, he stepped forward. That's funny, Richard, Ethan said coldly. Because last night, your daughter told me you tried to kill her. Richard froze. For the first time, his carefully controlled expression cracked. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes met Ethan's, and Ethan saw it, the flicker of recognition. The calculation. The moment Richard realized who he was dealing with. Mr. Bennett, Richard said smoothly, masking his surprise quickly. I wasn't expecting you. No, I bet you weren't, Ethan replied, his voice like steel. Richard sighed dramatically, shaking his head. My daughter is confused, he said. She's been struggling emotionally. She has a history of fabricating things. Ethan didn't blink. She didn't fabricate the bruises on her arms, he said. She didn't fabricate nearly drowning in the middle of a storm. Richard's jaw tightened. I don't know what she told you. She told me everything, Ethan cut in. A beat of silence. Then Richard smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was a warning. Let's be honest, Mr. Bennett, he said. You have no idea what you've stepped into. Ethan smiled back. You're right, he said. But I'm going to find out. Another pause. Then Richard adjusted his cufflinks. Well, he said, voice smooth, it's been a pleasure. But I should be getting back to my daughter now. He turned, ready to walk toward Emma's room. Ethan blocked his path. You're not going anywhere near her, he said flatly. Richard's eyes darkened. She's my daughter, he said. She's under my protection now, Ethan shot back. Richard's smile returned. Cold. Calculating. "This isn't over," he murmured. Ethan leaned in. "No," he said softly. "It's just beginning. A war begins." Ethan watched as Richard turned and walked away, disappearing through the hospital doors. The moment he was gone, Ethan pulled out his phone. "Lock down the hospital," he ordered his security team. "No one gets near Emma without my approval." He hung up and exhaled slowly. His instincts had been right. This wasn't just about a girl who had been thrown into the sea. This was about something bigger, something darker. And whatever secrets Richard Evans was hiding, Ethan was going to tear them apart. Because now, this wasn't just about Emma's survival. It was about justice, and Ethan Bennett had never lost a fight. The man who wouldn't let go. A silent war begins. Ethan Bennett was a man who thrived in controlled environments. Boardrooms, negotiation tables, high-stakes business deals where fortunes were won and lost with the stroke of a pen. But this was chaos. His hands curled into tight fists as he watched Richard Evans disappear through the hospital doors. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to follow, to drag the man back inside, and demand the truth. But Ethan wasn't reckless. No, he was strategic. And this was a war he was going to win. He pulled out his phone. "Lock down Emma's hospital room," he ordered his security team. "No one, not even a doctor, gets in without my say-so." A pause. Then, "And dig deeper into Richard Evans. I want everything. His business ties, his hidden accounts, his criminal records, the people he's paid off. I want to know what skeletons are in his closet before he even realizes the door is open." His voice was cold, calculated. Because now, this wasn't just about saving Emma. It was about ending the man who had tried to erase her. A daughter's fear. Emma Evans sat in her hospital bed, knees drawn up to her chest. Her hands were still trembling. She had been so close to being caught. Her father had been here. The man who had tried to drown her, the man who had left her to die, had walked into this very building, pretending to be a concerned parent. And for a moment, for just one terrifying second, she had felt completely helpless. She had felt 6 years old again, standing at the top of the staircase in their mansion, watching her father close a deal with dangerous men, whispering threats into the phone, talking about money that wasn't his to take. She had seen too much back then, too. And he had warned her, just like he always did. Good girls don't ask questions, Emma. Good girls know when to keep quiet. Her father had never needed to raise a hand to control her. His voice, his coldness, his absolute power over her life had been enough. But now she had spoken. She had told Ethan everything. And her father would never let that stand. The plan to escape. Ethan found Emma staring at the window, her body tense. "You're safe," he said quietly. She flinched. "No, I'm not." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Richard is gone." Emma finally turned to face him, her blue eyes wide and haunted. "He doesn't give up," she whispered. "You don't understand, Ethan. My father has connections. He can make people disappear." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had already figured that much out. His team had uncovered offshore accounts, bribery cases, money laundering operations buried beneath layers of shell companies. But there was one file that stood out. Richard Evans had been linked to multiple disappearances, former business partners, employees who had crossed him, even a family member, his own younger brother, who had vanished without a trace years ago. Ethan felt his blood run cold. Because Emma was right. Richard Evans didn't just get revenge. He got rid of people. Permanently. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, meeting her gaze directly. "You're not disappearing, Emma," he said. "I won't let that happen." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't know what he's capable of." Ethan leaned in, his voice firm. "And he doesn't know what I'm capable of." A beat of silence. Then, Emma exhaled shakily, looking down at her hands. "You should let me go," she whispered. "If I run far enough, maybe he won't." Ethan cut her off. Running won't save you. It never does. Emma looked up, and in that moment, she saw it. The unwavering certainty in Ethan's eyes. The kind of certainty that came from experience. Emma swallowed. You've been through something like this before, she realized. Ethan hesitated, just for a second. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. My ex-wife, he admitted. She was in an abusive relationship before I met her. Thought running would keep her safe. Emma's breath hitched. Did it? Ethan's face was haunted now. No, he said. Her past caught up to her. Emma felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she saw a path forward that wasn't just survival. It was justice. But to get there, she had to do something she had never done before. She had to fight back. Setting the trap. Ethan's mansion sat on the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the restless sea. It was the opposite of Emma's childhood home. Warm, lived in, safe. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Because now, Ethan was using it as bait. Richard Evans was watching. Ethan knew that. He had security cameras scanning every inch of the property, unmarked vehicles trailing Richard's known associates. The trap was set. Now, they just had to wait. Emma stood on the balcony that night, her hands gripping the railing. The wind was cold, but she barely felt it. She knew what was coming. She knew her father wouldn't stay in the shadows forever. And when he came, she would be ready. Behind her, Ethan's voice cut through the silence. You don't have to do this, he said. Emma turned. Her expression was stronger now. Sharper. Yes, I do. Ethan studied her. Then he nodded. Then we end this. Emma exhaled. For the first time since the night she had hit the water, she believed it. The man in the dark. It happened 3 nights later. The security system caught the first movement just past midnight. A shadow moving along the edge of the cliffs. Then another. Then 3 more. Ethan, watching from the control room, felt his muscles coil like a predator ready to strike. Showtime, he murmured. Emma sat beside him, watching the screens. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She just waited. And then, the doors to the mansion burst open. The end of the hunt. The night everything changed. The doors to Ethan's mansion burst open. A chilling wind rushed through the grand foyer as Richard Evans stepped inside, his presence as suffocating as the ocean that had nearly swallowed Emma alive. He wasn't alone. 3 men flanked him, men who didn't need introductions, their cold stares and scarred knuckles saying everything. This wasn't a father looking for his runaway daughter. This was a hunter retrieving his prey. Emma sat in the middle of the room, waiting. She had thought she would feel fear when this moment arrived. Instead, she felt nothing at all. Just calm. Because this time, she wasn't running. This time, she was fighting back. A father's final offer. Richard's steel-gray eyes locked onto hers. His expression was unreadable, but his hands clenched at his sides. Just for a moment. Just enough for Emma to recognize the first flicker of frustration. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be alive. Emma, he said smoothly, taking a step forward. It's time to come home. A cold laugh slipped from her lips. Home, she echoed, tilting her head. Is that what you call the place where you tried to drown me? Richard's smile didn't falter. Let's not dramatize things, sweetheart, he said, his voice practiced, patient, manipulative. You misunderstood what happened. You were never in danger. You panicked. That's all. Emma felt Ethan tense beside her, but she lifted a hand. She wanted to handle this herself. Tell me, she said, tilting her head, was it panic when you tried to cover up those missing offshore accounts? Richard's eyes flickered. A crack in the mask. Was it panic, she continued, when you had your business partner disappear after he found out you were laundering money? Richard exhaled slowly. Emma, Or was it panic when you hired men to come here and clean up your mess? Silence. Then Richard's smile vanished, and for the first time, Emma saw it. The man he really was. Not the charming businessman, not the polished philanthropist, but a man who had spent his entire life controlling everything around him. And now, he was losing control. The trap closes. Richard sighed, as if he were exhausted by the conversation. I didn't want it to come to this, he murmured. At his signal, his men moved forward. And that was their mistake, because Ethan had been waiting for it. The moment they stepped forward, a red laser dot appeared on Richard's chest. Then another. And another. His men froze. Ethan smirked. You really thought I wasn't ready for this? He asked, tilting his head. Richard's jaw clenched. Emma stood slowly, stepping forward, her voice calm and clear. You don't own me anymore, she said, and you don't own this situation. Richard didn't move. The realization sank in. He had already lost, because Ethan had called the authorities the moment Richard's men stepped onto the property. And now, the sound of sirens filled the air. Richard turned toward the door, his expression unreadable as flashing red and blue lights flooded the mansion's driveway. The police were here. And this time, he wasn't slipping away. The fall of a king. Richard Evans was a man who had spent years staying one step ahead. But tonight, his luck ran out. The police swarmed the mansion, guns drawn, orders shouted. Richard's men were taken down fast. But Richard, he didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't beg. He just turned to Emma one last time. And for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, not even regret, but fear. Because he knew he wasn't in control anymore. She was. As they led him away, he said nothing. And Emma, she didn't watch him go. She just turned away, because she wasn't afraid of him anymore. A new beginning. The house was quiet after the chaos. The police were gone. The storm was over. Emma stood by the cliffs, staring out at the endless stretch of ocean. The same ocean that had tried to swallow her whole. But she was still here. She had survived. And she wasn't running anymore. Footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Evan. You did it, he said softly. Emma exhaled, the wind pulling at her hair. No, she said. We did. Ethan nodded. For a long moment, they just stood there. The waves crashed below. The wind howled. And Emma finally, felt free. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.